Thank you, Julie. It's great to be here. Great to be back. Great to see some new faces and familiar faces, to be back with everybody. And studying Torah is something that keeps us alive and attentive to our neighbors and attentive to the needs of the human community in a sometimes unstable and dangerous and increasingly dangerous world where people's dignity and safety is being threatened. So let's dedicate our learning to be something that morally attunes us to be preserving life, the life of people who are being threatened by state encroachment. So here we are. We're talking about Parashat Sh'lach-Lecha. I'll also add on a personal note, this is the 34th anniversary of my bar mitzvah, this parsha. And it's a doozy. Just last week, we began to see the tightly ordered fabric of the Israelite community in the desert start to fray. Parshat Bamidbar, Parshat Naso, and the beginning of Bahalotcha are almost boring in their banality, if such a thing could be said, because everything is perfectly ordered. If you look closely, there are certain indications of covering over fraying fractures, but only in the middle of Bahalotcha do things start to come undone, right after Yitro and Moshe, Chovav and Moshe have seemed a failed conversation. And now in our parsha, things go full out haywire wrong. And we want to try to understand why. So I'm going to share my screen and jump right into it. So I've called this, you might have a different reading. I'm calling this The Scouts, a Lesson in Leadership Failure. Maybe we'll have to retitle it after we study. Maybe we'll encounter new things. I want to draw your attention to the very beginning of the Parsha, beginning of chapter 13 of the book of Bamidbar. Adonai spoke to Moshe, saying, "Send people to scout the land of Canaan, Sh'lach-Lecha anashim veyaturu et eretz Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. One person per ancestral tribe shall you send, each one a chieftain among them." So Moshe sent them out from the wilderness of Paran by Adonai's command. All of them people, leaders of the Israelites were they. Ish echad lemate avotav tishlachu kol nasi bahem. Vayishlach otam Moshe mimidbar Paran al pi Adonai. Kulam anashim, Rashi bnei Israel hema. Now, the question, even before we get into the story, we're actually only going to kind of dance around the actual story. If you're not familiar with the story, what happens is these 12 men go into the land and they go on a tour and they look at different parts of it. Moshe gives them specific questions to look at, to find out what's the produce like, what harvest is it. The narrator tells us that it's the time of first fruits of grapes, Bikurei Anavim, but they should scope out what's the land like, just people can get an agricultural sense, and also what can they expect in terms of, are there fortified cities or not fortified cities, like what's the landscape like. Never does Moshe ask them to give their opinion about the conquerability. The conquerability is a given. Moshe asks fact-oriented questions. Now that does leave a question, given that the conquerability is taken to be a given because Hashem promised it. Why does God command them to go on this mission in the first place? Why not just wait till they go in? What's the purpose of this fact-finding mission? It opens up a question of like, where exactly did the scouts go wrong? If they give an honest report of what they saw and honestly share that what they saw scared the dickens out of them, well, why did God send them on that mission to see that knowing that, the Canaanites and the Amalekites are there, etc. I want to keep that as a background question. The book of Devarim, when Moshe kind of retells it, Moshe tells it as though the people demanded, well, we're not going in and like waging war and starting a whole thing without seeing it first. You need to let us send scouts. That's Devarim's retelling. And maybe that's a detail that is assumed here and just not part of the narrative. But prior to verse 1, there's a backstory there of the people had been saying like, hey, we're nervous. And in that context, God says, let's do this. What I want to focus on is this potentially extraneous phrase in verse 3. Kulam anashim, all of them people, or all of them men. It's extraneous. The passage could have just said, send people to scout the land of Canaan, which I'm giving to the Israelites. One person per ancestral tribe shall you send, each one a chieftain among them. So Moshe sent them out from the wilderness of Paran by Adonai's command. Leaders of the Israelites were they, Rashi b'nei Israel Hema. What is added by this phrase, Kulam anashim? So I'll stop the share momentarily, and we can have a few minutes of brainstorming. I see Carrie also already has a hand up, and then Ginger, and then we'll see what other questions or thoughts get raised. Carrie, go ahead.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, we see right at the beginning, it doesn't say Shlach anashim, it says Sh'lach-Lecha anashim. Now, if it was a direct command from God to Moses, it would just say Shlach. That's a command. That's imperative. But Sh'lach-Lecha is more implies if you need to send them. In other words, it's more permission than a command.
That's very interesting. It's good read. So then in that context, how do you understand the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak, where God tells Abraham, Lech Lecha and bring your son up as an offering?
Well, in that I think God is actually testing Abraham. He's and I think Abraham failed the test. Mm-hmm. He's telling him to giving what obviously is a horrendous and morally totally there's no way you can rationalize that mm-hmm. command. And he's expecting Avram to stand up to him, and Abraham just which is a way that lots of Jewish thinkers from the 20th century on understand it, and nobody before the 20th century ever understood the text that way. Which is a fascinating conundrum. How like such a vast shift in understanding a text happened in one generation, that lecha, what is the grammatical force of that lecha? Carrie's offering a compelling reading. There's some other texts where they take a little bit more massaging, but that's a good possibility. Ginger and then Esther. You got to unmute yourself, Ginger. There you go.
Just a quick question. Maybe I'm way off base, but wouldn't God already know what the land is like?
Presumably, yeah.
No, I would think so. And so it's just back to, again, a test. And if these people came back with honest, on the way they saw it honestly, why did they get in trouble? And if he didn't expect different opinions, why did he send them there? If he wanted them all to have the same answer, why did he send 12 people? Mm-hmm. It makes no sense. I mean, and then
what it makes no sense is already a closing of possibility. Let's say, how about I'm struggling to make sense of this? That keeps it open. That keeps it open that you might actually.
I am struggling with trying to understand why God would send people when he already knew what was to be expected, and then they come back and God acted like that was something against him. When this was nothing against him, it was what they observed, and they get killed for it. So, not a nice guy at times. So, okay, thanks.
Okay, very worthy struggle there. It's sort of complicated because, like, the first few verses, they do respond with the facts of what they saw, but then when nobody asked them, they say, like, no, we can't go in, we have to revolt, we should go back to Egypt, and so on. And so where's the point at which they exceed their charge is complicated, but Ginger is raising a good question. What exactly was their charge and what's the point? Wasn't God opening this up? Esther, go ahead, unmute yourself, and then Noreen.
Actually, I have two comments. One is a historical one. The fact is that if you ask people for the name of the spies, we only remember Joshua and Caleb. So I think it's a very important historical message that if when you do something good, you're remembered. And my second comment is that the Torah makes a point of saying that it was the Nasi of every Shevet. So is it possible that they came with a negative report because they wanted to keep the status that they had in the Bamidbar?
So play that out, Esther. That's a very interesting proposition. Say more. Why they want to preserve the status they had in the desert?
Because as long as they were in the Midbar, they were the head of their tribe.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was looked for them. They didn't have to worry about Parnassah or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And the place of honor. So politically and selfishly, it was to their benefit, I guess, to give a negative report.
Why? So why would their power or honor be threatened if they go into the land?
Well, then it's the whole picture, the whole thing changes. They have to settle in the land, and then the whole structure will change, and they would lose their power. Now they have it.
Why would they lose their power? Let's be real explicit about this.
I think at that point, God will, the tribes will have to settle. The whole function of the community will change. They will become an agricultural community, and the position of the chief will change.
Great. That is a fascinating observation. We are going to come back to that. So hold those thoughts. We're gonna explore that actually in some depth. Noreen, why don't you give us the last comment of this stage, and then we'll move forward.
Well, it says send people. It doesn't say send spies. And he sends them on this tour bus, this group of 12. They're not exactly going to be inconspicuous. So I think that speaks to the purpose of the mission, that, go check it out and see what's there. So, like seeing, some of the commentaries said seeing the bride before the marriage kind of thing. So it's an informative kind of approach and so on. But also to Esther's point, I think they sent with the idea of the leaders is that they were afraid of success. They weren't afraid of failure. They were afraid of success, and they liked the status quo. So,
what do you have any textual cue to that? What is your textual cue to that, Mary?
To what?
So that they were afraid of success and that they had a vested interest in the status quo.
Well, I don't have the text in front of me, so I can't point to any one thing. But just the fact that. I don't know. I can't answer it without the.
Okay, but you're intuiting something, and I like that. Your comment really dovetails nicely with Esther's, and we're gonna go into that. Esther noted that popular Jewish memory hasn't preserved the names of the rest of the scouts, but the very beginning of our parsha, the next verse after what I quoted on our sheet, says them. So I think for our purposes, I'm going to share them. So here are the names of the people. From the tribe of Reuven was Shamua ben Zakur. From Shimon was Shaphat ben Chori. From the tribe of Yehuda was Kalev ben Yefuneh. He's one of the two who says that we can conquer it, believe in God. From the tribe of Yisachar was Igal ben Yosef. From Ephraim was Hoshea ben Nun, whom Moshe called Yehoshua, is the other one of the two. From the tribe of Binyamin was Palti ben Rafu. From Zvulun was Gadiel ben Sodi. From Menashe was Gadi ben Susi. From Dan was Amiel ben Gemali. From Asher was Satur ben Michael. From the tribe of Naphtali was Nachmi ben Vofsi. And from Gad was Geuel ben Machi. So those are the 12, have their names. Where, apparently they were famous. The text seems to go out of its way to say, several times, each one a chieftain, kol nasi bahem. So Moshe sent them out. All of them, people, kulam anashim, rashei b'nei Israel, ham, are leaders of the Israelites. So let's find out a little bit more about that terminology. So I'm going to share the screen again. What's this extraneous phrase, kulam anashim? Rashi points out that wherever the term anashim, I translate it as people, it might be gendered. Sometimes, it's hard with like pre-1970s androcentric texts of any language when whole communities are personified as male. We know that all 12 of these people were men because we got their names, but part of the problem in today's English of translating all of them were men, that might be freighted with implications that the text doesn't assume, that it'd be anachronistic, and it might not. I'm not sure. So I rendered it all of them people. It might be all of them men, might be all of them machers. We'll see. Rashi points out that whenever the word anashim, people or men, is used in scripture, it's terminology of importance. Lashon chashivut. At that time, these were worthy people. His point is that later on, they become disgraced people. But at that time, the point is that don't think that there were a bunch of ne'er-do-wells or zlubs who were appointed. These were respected people. Moshe reasonably appointed, or the tribes appointed people who were already respected as leaders. That should already make us start thinking about Noreen and Esther's points. So Rabbi Avadia Seforno says something a little more specific and gives us biblical associations. Kulam anashim means anshe chayil. This is very similar to Rashi. These are powerful men, men of valor. These are maybe warriors, or at least powerful men. And then he gives us two biblical citations, such as in Shmuel Aleph, chapter 26, you're a man, aren't you? Halo ishata. And also the beginning of Kings, chapter 2, verse 2, v'chazakta v'hayita le'ish. Now, I want us to look at those two passages because that actually helps frame something about manhood or personhood or leadership as it's maybe being framed, at least according to Seforno, in our passage. And what already the Torah might be hinting at, is there a kind of dark, foreboding, foreshadowing, even with all the fanfare of like these were machers and leaders. So in chapter 26 of the first book of Shmuel, the context is that Shaul has really been going mad and is obsessed in paranoia that David and his son Yonatan are staging a coup to overthrow him, and that David is going to overthrow him. And as a result, Shaul has now for several chapters been going after David, trying to kill David. David is in hiding, is a refugee, is fleeing from Shaul. And there's one night when Shaul and his camp are going after David, when Shaul's camp all goes to sleep and David's camp sees where they are, sneak into Shaul's camp, and David's assistant wants to go kill Shaul preventively, and David says, God forbid, don't even think of laying a hand on Shaul. He's the anointed of God, of Jewish people. Can't kill someone like that. It's also a shrewd move, knowing that, like, if he does become king, he would now be setting up his own, the paradigm for his own assassination. He gets more strength with the people by having access to kill Shaul and not doing it. In any event, he has this person go in, and he goes and like cuts the hem of Shaul's garment so that Shaul knows he was there. Now he goes back to safety across a valley, and Avner, Shaul's general, calls out, wait, is that David? Who is that? What's going on? Is that David? And David cries out across the valley to Avner, Hello, Ishata? Aren't you a man? There's no one like you in Israel, so why didn't you keep watch over your lord the king? For one of the troops came to do violence to your lord the king. It's not good, this thing you have done, as Adonai lives. You all deserve to die because you didn't keep watch over your lord. Adonai's anointed. Look around. Where the king's spear and the water jar which were at his head? You let me steal them. What kind of man are you? So that's the way the word ish is used there, as like a strong, valorous protector of the king. Not being a man is somehow there's a gendered combination of almost like emasculation with weakness, something we see in many other toxic masculine cultures. We see that even stronger in the first book of Kings, verse 2. So in the first chapter, we see David is close to dying. He seems to be out or doesn't realize that his son Absalom is basically anointing himself king, staging a coup. He seems immune to the fact that his prophet Natan and his wife Bathsheba and his son Shlomo conspire to make him give his imprimatur on something else that he had never said he would do, that Shlomo should be the king. They're like, don't you remember you told us Shlomo should be king? Torah, the text never says he did that. But in any event, he seems to be out of it. He can't be warmed by even a sexy young lady. Finally, in chapter 2, David's time to die drew near. Okay, his time to die drew near. He instructed his son Shlomo as followers, I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong and be a man. V'chazakta v'hayita la'ish. Keep the charge of Adonai your God, walking in his ways, following his laws, his commandments, his rules, and his admonitions as recorded in the teaching of Moshe, in order that you may succeed in whatever you do and wherever you turn. Then Adonai will fulfill his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your descendants are scrupulous in their conduct and walk before me faithfully with all their heart and soul, no man of yours shall be cut off from the throne of Israel. Further, Vigam, you know what Yoav ben Tzruya did to me, what he did to the two commanders of Israel's forces, Avner the son of Ner and Amasa son of Yeter. He killed them, shedding blood of war in peacetime, staining the girdle of his loins and the sandals of his feet with the blood of war. So you're a smart guy. Act in accordance with your wisdom. See that his white hair does not go down to Shaul in peace. But deal kindly with the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, for they befriended me when I fled from your brother Avshalom. Let them be among those that eat at your table. You must also deal with Shemi ben Gera, the Benjaminite from Bachram. He insulted me outrageously when I was on my way to Machanaim. But he came down to meet me at the Jordan. I swore to him by Adonai, I will not put you to the sword. So do not let him go unpunished. You're a wise man. You'll know how to deal with him and send his gray hair down to Shaul in blood. So David slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. Very chilling end to David's life. His last moments are giving instructions for how to take revenge on his enemies. It's almost as if when you think of like the last scene of the Godfather, if that had all happened on the father, on the original Don's instruction, there's like an inversion where Michael Corleone says, to his father before his father dies, you promised you wouldn't be the one to instigate war with the 5 families. I didn't make any such promise. So you have to keep that. So David is already predicting a similar kind of thing. And he's like, I swore not to do anything to Shimi ben Gera, so I'm stuck. You're a smart guy, though. Figure out what you need to do. Now, we have this problem of verses 3 to 5. The text reads much more smoothly from a literary perspective and from the idioms of the Hebrew if you skip verses 3 to 5. I'm going the way of all the earth. Be strong and be a man. You know what Yoav ben Tzruya did to me, what he did to the two commanders of Israel's forces. He killed them, shedding war in peacetime, staining the girdle of his loins and sandals of his feet. To act in accordance with your wisdom, see that his white hair doesn't go to Shaul in peace, etc. In fact, biblical scholars argue based on literary style that the core text is an early text, and then 3 or 4 centuries later, the Deuteronomic author and editor is really freaked out by David looking so Corleone-ish, so dark, so what a dark ending, and inserts this very Sefer Devarim language in the beginning. Even so, literarily though, with the redacted text as we have it, it's he still ends as he ends. And before that, he's like, okay, here, be strong and be a man. So now I'm going to tell you all of the official things you have to do. Keep all the mitzvot, act properly, act justly, and also take revenge on your enemies and make sure that these people don't go down. Yoav ben Tzruya, by the way, was David's most loyal general for a long time until at the end, when David was really at his most bloodthirsty, Yoav ben Tzruya kind of went rogue. And David didn't forget it, even in his cognitive weakness. So we see these two examples of V'hayita la'ish, be a man, having this sense of like big man on campus, or in a toxic masculinity sense of like manhood. All of these were strong men. They were maybe in the sense of tyrants, strong men, strong-armed people. I'll stop the share. I see there are a few hands. Take a couple of brief comments, and then we'll go back into the kind of the heart of it. Mark and Rabbi Joan, in that order. Go ahead. Mark, you got to unmute yourself.
Okay, so this parsha always disturbs me. You're sending men into Canaan. Canaan belongs to the Canaanites. We have a commandment, don't steal. And so it seems to me we're violating one of the commandments. We're going there, we're scouting the land for the purposes of stealing it from the Canaanites. How is this morally correct? I mean, is God violating one of his own commandments?
Well, meaning because God said don't steal, and it sure seems. So God's answer to that in the book of Devarim, I don't know if this is really a question for Parashat Ekev, not Sh'lach-Lecha, but be that as it may, in Parashat Ekev, Sefer Devarim's answer, which I don't know if this will be convincing to you, Mark, or not, or to me, or to any of us, but what Parashat Ekev says is that the 7 Canaanite nations have crossed the line of moral violations. And God says to the Israelites, don't think that you deserve this land. You don't. You're not worthy. I'm not having you. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say God's giving us this land because we're so righteous. That's not true. It's because of the wickedness of these nations, I'm dispossessing them. In other words, I have beef with them that's independent of you and has nothing to do with you. And you had good ancestors. You're no goods yourself, but I liked your ancestors. Somebody's got to steward this land, so I'm giving you a shot. That is God's read of it. If the 7 Canaanite nations were righteous nations who didn't pass children to Moloch, according to Parashat Ekev, maybe we would stay wandering in the desert. We wouldn't have any right to dispossess them, or we'd have to go coexist with them. That's what God says in Parashat Ekev. Perhaps that's rosy-eyed, retroactive justification from an historical perspective. Be that as it may, the Torah seems interested in letting that not be a predictive text for dispossessing anybody else. These 7 nations happen to be doomed for dispossession because of their own immorality. Rabbi Joan, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I was just asking if you could enlarge the text, and that's already been taken care of for me, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Bamia, go ahead. Bamaya, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. I was struck by what you just said because I don't think that I ever caught that. And so I'm a little bit concerned about the present day and some of our attitudes towards the land. Like I always understood, and somebody had even written in the chat, as the land being promised to us, and I'd always read it under that view. and to look at it as like, oh, it's not because you're great, it's because they suck. That puts a whole different view than on like, you know, current Israeli politics. Is just a little upsetting to me, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and the way Parashat Eikev put, that's not the only voice in Tanakh and Torah. Like, I mean, already Abraham has promised this land. So the question is, does the Parashat Eikev view already obtain then that these nations are irredeemable? I don't know. But Parashat Eikev's perspective is that there's nothing predictable about this. It's a one-time thing because these 7 nations happen to have behaved immorally. One can no longer say in the future, well, we're promised this land, other people in the way have to be dispossessed because they're not passing children to Moloch. So, you know, you have to be told directly from God that these nations are, God has doomed them to destruction. And not any other nation. It's not just because they're in Israel's way, it's because totally irrelevant from Israel, from the Jewish people, they've acted immorally. That's what God says about those 7 particular nations who have nothing to do with contemporary geopolitics because they don't exist. I see there are a couple other hands. I'm going to go back to the text because I want to show you a couple other things, and then we'll have some time for comments and questions at the end. So here we go. So we have a sense maybe of what's being implied with this extra phrase, kulam anashim. Maybe it's to heighten the sense of their dignity, like that these are machers, these were already political leaders. Think about Esther's comment, Noreen's comment at the beginning. They were already political leaders. It wasn't random lottery for who would represent each tribe. It was their pre-existing leaders. And we also get maybe a sense, according to the verses Seforno brings up, of the kind of qualities that had been elevated for leadership up until now. A kind of maybe machismo sense of military strength, power, etc. Be that as it may, we find a midrashic interpretation in the Zohar. Now, the Zohar, from an historical perspective, is a 13th century work, and so that's why we're reading it, after we've read Rashi. Jewish mythology, it's attributed to the 3rd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and so maybe it should be read prior to that, but it's not quoted by anyone later than that. So we're going to read it from its historical chronology. So here's the Zohar's interpretation. Kulam anashim, they were all people, all of them worthy, and all leaders of Israel. Kulhan zakain havu v'reshe d'Yisrael havu. But they took bad counsel for themselves. About inun dibru d'legamayu ita bisha. Amai. Why did they take bad counsel? I misspelled counsel the second time. They reasoned, if Israel will be brought up to the land, we will be removed from leadership, and Moshe will appoint other leaders. For we are worthy in the desert to be leaders, but in the land, we will not be worthy. So 2 points for Esther and for Noreen for exactly predicting the Zohar. Or maybe you'd read this text before. Because they took bad counsel for themselves, they died along with everyone who took their word. So the question of what went wrong is fundamentally a question of old guard leaders worrying about their own preservation rather than about the well-being of the community. And maybe the very factors that made them eligible to and made them chashuvim and seen as leaders and dignitaries up until now were exactly factors that made them unfit for this future-oriented task. What do we do when we have machers in place? When you have, let's say, in a lot of Jewish leadership settings, synagogue boards entirely of seniors having decision-making conversations about what to be done for the youth with no youth in the room. Or a council of presidents of major Jewish organizations, Kulam Anashim Rashi B'nai Israel Hema, making decisions about the Jewish future without significant young representation. Now, I want to be cautious and not go into a problem similar, the mirror image problem of just sanctifying youth, but there is a question of what are the criteria on which we appoint people for particular roles. The Zohar seems to be suggesting that maybe these 12 individuals reached their chashivut status for good reasons, but the reasons that led them to power were not well matched with what was needed for this particular task. And you see, they go into the land of Israel and they say, well, we are now completely uncomfortable. We're completely out of our element here. And you listen to some of the things that they said. I mean, here in chapter 13, after they've given the more factual but scary depiction of the land, and after Caleb and Yoshua start to say, no, or Caleb says, we can do it. So thus they spread defamation among the Israelites about the land they had scouted, saying, the land we traversed and scouted, it's a land that devours its inhabitants. Well, I mean, now we're getting to a point where they're very far from what they observed. They did not observe the land devouring any inhabitants. This is the only thing they can see in the future. There's no way we could thrive in this place. Think of like that scene in the Shawshank Redemption with that dignitary, I'm forgetting his name, who was the librarian in the prison. And he was a macher in prison. Everybody respected him. Once he was released from prison after 40 years, he was an ex-con, and technology has changed. He didn't know how to operate. He had become institutionalized, in the language of the Shawshank Redemption. And here, similarly, these guys, these 10 of the 12 guys, see the land which God has promised them as in Eretz Ochelet Yoshvei. It devours its inhabitants. All the people we saw in it are men of huge measure. Anshe Midot. We saw the Nephilim there, the sons of the giant from the Nephilim. So they're in mythology. We saw Paul Bunyan. We saw Jack in the Book. We saw giants. Everyone's giants there. They're huge. Everybody was 20 feet tall. We were in our own eyes as grasshoppers, and so were we in their eyes. Immediately after that, the whole community lifted their voice, giving voice and weeping that night. And again, these were leaders. These are people that the people respect. All the Israelites complained against Moshe and Aaron, saying, if only we had died in the land of Egypt or in this wilderness, if only we might die. Seeing a kind of death wish in the perception of the old guard. Why is Adonai taking us to that land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our children will become booty. Wouldn't have spoils. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said one man to another, let us put up a head and return to Egypt. It's a fascinating midrash in the Tanhuma that picks up on this language at the end of chapter 13. We were in our own eyes as grasshoppers, and so were we in their eyes. We were in our own eyes as grasshoppers. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Blessed Holy One, said, that one I could let go. I could forgive them for their fear, basically, of seeing themselves as small. But when they said, and so were we in their eyes, that I became angry. That I really hikpadati. Do you know how I made you look in their eyes? You don't know that. Who told you they didn't look like angels in their eyes? You have no idea. And you're actually misusing your status. The status, the power you have over other people in the community is power that is not actually relevant for the situation here. You were chosen for a specific task. Tell us where there are cities, tell us what the fruit's like, what the produce is like. And you did that, and you also said, because we are nisi'im, we have the power to say other things and to use the power that we know will be listened to say things that actually aren't your expertise. You're saying things that are actually, with some distance, patently absurd. There are giants there. And they saw us as grasshoppers. You didn't talk to them. You don't know that. Often, there's a problem of people who are in positions of power are misjudging, and the people misjudge the meaning of their power. What is their power actually good for in terms of insight? Dr. Aviva Gottlieb-Zornberg, in her book on the Book of Numbers, says fear in a situation of war is a rational emotion, but the reaction that the spies arouse in the people is not entirely rational. The people weep all night. They wish they had died in Egypt or else in this wilderness. Evidently, they would prefer to be dead than to face the danger of death. They both fear death and wish for it, deciding to return to Egypt, the very site of death. In these last 2 minutes, I want to point out a chidush, an innovation of my rabbi, my teacher, Rav David Bigman, of the Rosh Yeshiva of Ma'ale Gilboa in Israel, the religious kibbutz movement, who points out in his book of collected oral teachings on Parashat Shavua, which is available in both Hebrew and English, that you get a little sense of the scouts being kind of old world, nomadic leaders. Even the fact that several of their names are animal names. Kalev ben Yefuneh, a dog. Gadiel ben Susi, son of a horse. There's one more, Ben Gemali, Ben Gemali, son of camel. And similarly, right after the scout episode ends, after the Ma'apilim, the land fetishists, the fascists go up to try to, they thought that the scouts' problem was rejecting the land when actually it was rejecting God, and they go and try to conquer the land without God, and they get routed. So after that all ends, chapter 15, we have these apparently totally unrelated mitzvot. Adonai spoke to Moshe saying, speak to the Israelite people and say, when you enter the land, harsh words when they just got punished saying you're not going to enter the land for 40 years. Okay, when you enter the land, God is immediately focused on this is still going to happen, but here are some new laws. And you would present an offering by fire from the herd or from the flock, whatever kind of sacrifice it is. Verse 4, the person who presents the offering to Adonai shall bring a meal offering also, 1/10 of a measure of choice flour. And you shall also order 1/4 of a hin of wine as a libation for each sheep. Now, what Rav Bigman points out, what's important about that seems very banal and whatever, just more sacrificial law. There's something very insistent in this moment, immediately after this catastrophe, to say, you're going to enter the land, it's going to be 40 years later, you're going to go in, and when you do it, sacrifices have to not just include the familiarity of nomadic people, animals, but also produce. There have to be produce offerings. You all don't know jack about produce right now. You don't know from meal offerings, you don't know from wine libations, because you're just eating manna. And all you have is animals. You don't have produce right now. And things are going to change. The minute you go into the land, you're a landed people. If you're a people who only focuses on what you know now and the expertise of how to offer burnt offerings with animal sacrifices, it'll fail. You have to have updated leadership who understands the landscape around you and isn't afraid of it. Every sacrifice includes a meal offering and a wine libation. That is the new world. Moreover, every citizen, when presenting an offer by fire of pleasing order, shall do so with them. And when throughout the ages a stranger, a ger, who has taken up residence with you, or one who lives among you, would present an offering to Adonai, as you do, so shall it be done by the rest of the congregation. There shall be one law for you and for the resident stranger. It shall be a law for all time throughout the ages. You and the stranger shall be alike before Adonai. The same ritual and the same rule that shall apply to you and to the stranger who resides among you. Torah achat mishpat echad yelachem v'lager hagar itchem. Leaders who have gotten their power up until now have done so in a context just of ancestral memory. And that's important. But it's not necessarily more important or important to the exclusion of contemporary horizontal memory. of community making. And in the future, Gerim, people who don't share in that ancestral memory, who people like Amiel Ben Gemali are going to say don't really have a role in our people. No, if they are contemporarily living and sustaining this land and living in the body politic today, they're subject to the same responsibilities, rights, access. The community continues to evolve and change. That is the law. And Rav Bigman interprets that these aren't random laws that are just appended here. These are specific responses to the catastrophe of the Scouts, because the catastrophe of the Scouts was a catastrophe of a community sending the wrong people for the job, thinking that skills and knowledge of one domain necessarily translates into expertise in a totally different domain, when in fact, usually it's the opposite. And maybe the 12 representatives for this job should have been no names. These 12 should have maintained dignitary roles in the desert. But if you are in a position of responsibility and you sense the world shifting around you, your job is to adapt, and if that's not in your capacity, to accept an emeritus honorific title and to transfer power and authority over those who are able to read and adapt. That maybe is the message of this parsha, and I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and turn it back over to Julie for closing.